This is a conversation with Max Keiser. Max Keiser is the host of the Keiser Report and the Orange Pill podcast. He's been reporting on Bitcoin since it was $1. He has a background in finance and comedy and is a fascinating person willing to speak his mind. His work to write stories and analogies with his co-host Stacey Herbert has made the financial world more understandable and interesting and has positively affected many people. This podcast is sponsored by me. Go to joshterryplays.com to see what I'm up to. Thank you very much for coming on.
Josh, great to see you. Great to be with you. Exciting times in the Bitcoin world.
Yes, it is. You guys have been working in this space for a long time. I've been a fan of your work for quite a while, but going back and looking at it for this interview, I got even more into it. I love the way you guys have approached things. So I want to start with this. Joseph Campbell spoke about mythology being a method of exposing truth. And I wanted to ask, do you believe stories can expose truths in ways that other things cannot?
Yeah, sure. You know, the classic hero with 1,000 faces, I believe, one of his works, I believe. So this gets in touch with a certain hard-coded repetitiveness in the hero's journey or our journey, our story. And this plays into the Bitcoin protocol because it hard codes one variable in our existence, and that is money, and turns it into perfect money. And so it gives access to this heroic journey to anybody, everybody. And now we're seeing it play out in places like El Salvador. So I think it's a keen observation, and I'm keenly interested in that, and I believe that to be true.
So you guys have utilized story in so many different ways. From what you were just saying, are you saying that the truth that exposed is the commonality between the stories?
Yeah, there's stories that are part of the destiny or part of the fate or part of our common experience. And these stories have been with us, for thousands of years. The Greeks codified them in terms of their work as dramatists and writers, and it was quite repetitive throughout history. And these are stories that reflect our nature, and they have the tendency to play out continuously. And so we, as Shakespeare said, all the world's a stage and everyone's merely a player. Essentially, we're all in this big drama together. Again, with Bitcoin, you have something that is new, and it's something new that, going all the way to 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, we haven't seen anything like this. And so it's really having a profound impact on this narrative, the stories we tell each other, the stories we tell ourselves, the stories that we're a part of. So it's a new way to tell these stories. The Greeks invented kind of modern theater with the proscenium arch, which is the idea of a stage, and they tell a story on stage, and that's kind of virtual reality from 2,500 years ago. And they had the Greek chorus, and they're like the trolls, the troll box, the trolls, and they're kind of commenting on the action. And so now here we are 2,500 years later, and it's similarly playing out. The big difference is with money, and money is now been perfected. And so how this impacts us and our stories and the way we interact with each other, it's going to have a profound impact. And we're seeing it play out. We can't really say where it's going exactly, but we can have an intuition about it based on the past.
I think that you and Stacey are amazing storytellers. And was it a conscious thought to go into analogy, go into comedy story, or was that just a specific decision, or was it an evolution over time?
Well, you bring up an interesting point. So in Bitcoin, there are people who are educators, there are people who are technologists, and there are people who are educating folks about the technology. And they're not necessarily storytellers. They're informing the people, the public, about this remarkable technology. And it's not framed as a story. So in our case, that's why I don't consider ourselves to necessarily be educators in that sense, because we're not walking people through the technology and, You have people like BTC Sessions, who does these great videos, and he's an educator, and this is how you set up a node, and here they put tab A into slot B, and right. So that's not necessarily a story per se. So I guess it goes back to our backgrounds. So Stacy has always been really involved, going all the way back to her university days, studying story construction and storytelling. Again, going back 2,500 years or so or longer. The Grand Master Aristotle and his Poetics kind of laid the groundwork for all storytelling that came after it. And she's had experience as a script doctor in both the UK and in Los Angeles. So, and for writing the scripts for the show, she's always working on bringing her expertise and trying to get the greatest story out there, and using techniques like juxtaposition and other techniques to flesh out great stories. In my case, I've had similar kind of background looking at the classics, storytelling, theater, but I've also had a lot of experience in performing and television and radio. So that's kind of, I bring that side to it. So, that's kind of the dynamic in a lot of ways. I'm kind of like acting out to some degree, or performing the Stacy scripts. And so there are stories. And so the stories are meant to be evocative. The content's meant to be stimulating, people to dive in, to take another look, to tap into our universal affiliation and affinity for stories, and to build a narrative that is very inclusive. And that's what I would say. And like I said, it's not so much for us about, let's say, education per se, because a lot of people do a great job educating folks on how this technology works. There are a few storytellers, and there are a lot of really crappy stories. We talk about the shitcoins, and the shitcoins typically have pretty terrible stories, and the storytellers behind them are not very good storytellers. And I think that's one of the reasons why they never have succeeded.
Do you think more people should be trying to tell stories right now?
I think everyone brings to the Bitcoin who they are. So if you're like a Michael Saylor, who's an engineer, who's a CEO, who's been in the technology business for 20 years, you come to it from that perspective, and you give it your best as a financial engineer and a software engineer, and you become your best Bitcoin person. If you're somebody who's, more naturally have an inclination towards storytelling, that's our background. We do it, that's who we are. That's what we bring to the party. Other people's are educators. So you can't really escape who you are. You are who you are. So Bitcoin asks you to be the best at what you are, who you are, in the service of Bitcoin. So it could be, the guy who runs Tahini's restaurants. He's an excellent restaurateur. He put Bitcoin on the balance sheet, and he's bringing shawarma and Bitcoin. That's who he is. He's a restaurateur, and he's bringing the best Mediterranean food in the world. That's who he is. And so that's what he's bringing to the Bitcoin party. So everybody brings what they can bring. It's bring your own. So that's it. We're bound to who we are. Be who you are. Be the best at who you are in the service of Bitcoin, and that's the best anyone can do.
This is really interesting because I initially started wanting to talk about story, and it was very interesting how it quickly became sort of how your story reacts to Bitcoin, which brings to mind a story that I have in my mind about Bitcoin, which is there's items that we see in our world that we feel like there's an environment, and here's an item in the environment. And then there's other items that we see that we perceive as the environment. So, a hurricane, it is the environment. There's no, decide to take or leave this hurricane. You deal with it as it is. A field, a city. But, a baseball, sitting in the environment, we can choose to address it or not. And I perceive this current financial revolution, what's happening in the Bitcoin space, and all of the decentralization is happening as an environmental shift versus something within the environment shifting. What are your thoughts on that sort of an idea?
Right. Well, there's three basic stories. I believe, again, going back to Aristotle, there's man versus man versus the environment, and man versus himself. So you're describing man versus the environment. That's one of three stories. And that's a story that is played out in Bitcoin, as is the one man versus man and man versus himself. So that's an environmental story. That's a story. That's one of the big three. So we see that playing out in Bitcoin with the energy FUD, right? Because on one side, a group of folks are saying, hey, Bitcoin's boiling the oceans. And then on the other side, it's like, whoa, wait a minute. Bitcoin uses less than 0.1% of all global energy, and it uses wasted energy that would have been wasted anyway, mostly, right? So there's a counter argument to this. And that's a big topic at the moment. We have an existential story from the central banks who are saying, Bitcoin is threatening people's way of life that only the fiat money peddlers at the central banks can accomplish. And you shouldn't challenge the central banks and their fiat money. And so this is man versus man, right? So this is Max versus Christine Lagarde over there at the ECB. The storylines are she's the devil with fiat money, and I am a heroic figure representing Bitcoin, right? So it's a clash. When I do my live shows, I do a Christine Lagarde impression, and, I play that out dramatically on stage. It couldn't be any clearer. There's the villain, I'm the hero, we go at it, and there's that story.
So even your Twitter name says Bitcoin maximalist. The idea that Bitcoin becomes a fundamental element of the world economy, can you talk about what led you to that conclusion? And in your mind, what's the importance of there being one true coin? Why do you think of it that way?
Well, it's come over time. So I've been involved for 10 years, and over time, I've become a maximalist. And because after considering all other options and giving it a lot of thought over many years, I arrived at maximalism. And I see how, and I'm still very much in the throes of learning and living and experiencing Bitcoin. And so the journey is still going. I haven't reached the end of the journey. But at this point, I see how Bitcoin is essentially perfect money, which means perfect price discovery. And that opens up a whole lot of interesting corollaries and has a profoundly positive impact on humans. And so the more I open myself up to this idea of perfect money, and Bitcoin, in my view, is really the only coin, the only money that's not only is it decentralized, but it's becoming more and more decentralized, which I don't see that with any other shitcoin. I don't see that with fiat money, obviously. I don't see that with gold. And I only see with Bitcoin, the heroic journey of Bitcoin is to be increasingly more decentralized. We just saw a huge movement of mining concentration out of China into other countries, right? So geographically, mining is becoming more decentralized. That happened due to the protocol's perfect ability to lift us as spiritual creatures, to lift our spirits and to take us on this journey. So that's why I always come back to the Bitcoin maximalism. I don't see at this point, I don't see any downside to this. The pushback you get sometimes is like, oh, you're a quote toxic Bitcoin maximalist. And again, after going through this for 10 years, 2 points. Number one, Bitcoin is on its own vector. Bitcoin's on a vector and nobody's going to stop it. Nobody can stop the vector that Bitcoin's on. There's no toxicity as far as Bitcoin is concerned. It doesn't care. The blocks are going to come every 10 minutes, no matter what anybody does, no matter what country does, no matter what a regulator does, and no matter what the environment does. Conceivably, humans could be extinct and Bitcoin would still be generating blocks. that's the possibility. Like we have to get on with, get right with Satoshi, right? We have a chance to make right here. So it's up to us. Bitcoin's fine. Nobody's going to stop it. The second point is that after looking at thousands of projects over 10 years, there's just nothing remotely in the same zip code as Bitcoin. There's just nothing out there. They're all complete crap. And that's what I've come to realize. So there's no way to oversell it. There's no way to overdo it. There's no way to kill it. The founding fathers of the United States were essentially toxic maximalists for freedom. And a lot of people, a third of the country did not want to enter the Revolutionary War in America. A third of the population was indifferent, kind of ambivalent. And a third of the population wanted to have a revolutionary war. So not even a majority of the population wanted a revolutionary war. And those are the toxic maximalists. I'm sure 2/3 of the population refer to the founding fathers as toxic maximalists. Why are you dumping tea into the harbor? That's toxic. Why are you shooting redcoats? That's toxic. Okay, well, we all now in America benefit from their toxic maximalism. And the great thing about Bitcoin, of course, is that it's nonviolent. So all you have to do is hodl. So hodl is the Boston Tea Party of the 21st century.
Michael Saylor, I believe, spoke to this idea. I think he's pretty well known for talking about when something hits a certain market cap, it's kind of unstoppable past that point. Can you speak a little bit to the massive scale of what's actually happening? Because our time scales are shifting absurdly in the world right now. Like things that used to take 100 years are now taking 10. Things that should have taken 50 years are taking a couple of days. It's really, really weird. Can you speak a little bit to the size and scale of what's happening right now?
Yeah, Bitcoin was always going to achieve escape velocity. And it's funny because the notes of Satoshi in the early days, there was concern that when WikiLeaks was going to accept Bitcoin, that it might draw too much of the wrong type of attention. And there was concern in the very early, almost prenatal Bitcoin days that they could be open to an attack. But that never happened. And Bitcoin achieved escape velocity really within a few years. I mean, certainly after the fork wars and the SegWit adoption of 2017, it was completely free to dominate. And that's when Michael Saylor keys in on that moment, is really when he saw that the nodes and the decentralization were paramount, and that vested interest of corporations like the New York Agreement, as it's called, were unable to change the protocol. And this gave him the confidence to go in there and start to really study it and to build a big position. The FUD that comes out sometimes about being a potential Bitcoin killer, and, Bitcoin is the quote MySpace, this or that. From a technology point of view, from his experience, and remember, he's been a CEO for over 20 years and going all the way back to the dot-com days. He's saying, look, in my experience, and I've written books about it, and I've been an investor in all these things. Once network hits critical mass, it goes vertical. You have that hockey stick moment, and it becomes the dominant network. And you've never seen in history an example of that reversing, which makes absolute sense. And from his perspective, it's a great insight that people, particularly in the technology business, should take heed, because he's certainly somebody who you would want to listen to. In my view, it never really needed to achieve escape velocity that wasn't already baked into the Genesis block. So the Genesis block itself, it already won. So Bitcoin won on January 3rd, 2009. That was the day it won. And so all the other concern about it since then has been misplaced, in my view, and none of it's come to pass. There's never really been a threat, in my view, to the Bitcoin. And obviously in 2021, with the network at a block height of, I don't know what it is, 700,000, It's well past any even remote chance of anyone coming anywhere near touching it. No nation state, no group of nation states, nobody. I mean, Josh, I mean, it's so crazy that we've seen in the last 12 months a lot of reports coming out in mainstream media about aliens and UFOs. So where
Yeah.
did that come from? I mean, I think that that's Bitcoin related in that they're so frustrated at the success of Bitcoin and the inability of any institution to do anything about it, and the existential threat this poses to the entire banking system, the central banking system, and all the NGOs and the Davos crowd, that they're actually resorting to UFO porn and UFO fear to try to get people, to distract people somehow. In that, that we are well past success at that point when Christine Lagarde is basically worried about UFOs coming and an alien invasion. Bitcoin is doing its job and doing it really well.
Yeah, it's getting weird. I'm going to ask a prequel question, and then I'm going to ask one that ties into that. So far as I can tell, humans have always had about the attention span of a goldfish. Like anytime you like try sitting down to meditate, for 5 seconds, pretty quickly you realize your mind, doesn't stick to any one thing real for very long. But I'd like to start talking a little bit about inflation. And I believe that inflation tends to move people towards short-term thinking. And I think the internet has sort of accentuated the fact that we have the attention span of a goldfish. It's shown it to be true, but I don't know that that's so much of a problem as the fact that now we're, I think, incentivized to be short-term in some ways, and particularly in the financial world. And I think I've seen you speak a little bit about this. How does inflation make us more short-term? And yeah, I just want to open up that side of things.
Right. Well, there's two distinct questions there: inflation and short-term thinking. So on the short-term thinking front, it's true that, as you say, vast majority of people have attention spans of a goldfish, and that this is exacerbated by the instant gratification of social media and the internet and apps that go with it. But this is a de-evolution. This wasn't always the case. The one of the precepts or ideas behind religion, for example, all religions, is meditation, a knowledge of something outside of yourself, a spiritual being, and this type of idea where you have a reflection, even going back to Socrates, his main tenet was know thyself, right? This would require meditation and reflection and quiet time. And this has been with us in a struggle throughout, because great thinkers, theologians, philosophers made the suggestion that when our minds become disquieted and we're jumping around erratically in our heads, we make bad choices and bad decisions, which can lead to things like war, for example. And that's to be avoided, and other, let's say, negative outcomes. So it's not a foregone conclusion that we are simply incapable of reflection and meditation. And a lot of people, are out there promoting meditation and trying to get people to calm down and not to give in to the distractions that we're exposed to 24/7. Now, how inflation kind of fits into this is that inflation, it's a monetary event. Money printing leads to inflation. Now, it's interesting that both the word inflation and deflation have several definitions depending on who you talk to. So, but for the sake of this convo, let's say money printing results in inflation, and it's a monetary policy, and monetary policies and governance issues have been around for hundreds of years. And there is a cycle. It's called a business cycle. There's inflation, then there's a response, like Paul Volcker did in the 70s to raise interest rates. And then there's a contraction or a recession, and then the whole cycle repeats. What we've seen since Alan Greenspan was a repeal of the business cycle and the repeal of a central bank that's there to moderate extremes and the introduction of the activist central bank as hero, right? Alan Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen, and Jay Powell see themselves on a heroic journey of money printing, that they are saving us with their money printing. It's a warped idea. It's the hero gone crazy. It's like the Joker in Batman, who sees himself as a hero while he's burning mountains of money, right? That's who we have running the monetary policy. And the result is inflation. And the inflation this time, what's worrying is that because nobody's there actively working to moderate the effects and the impacts of inflation, people are starting to panic. And they panic by buying stuff quite fast before the price goes up. And hyperinflation is something that we are at risk of experiencing. And hyperinflation is less of a monetary event, and it's more of a political event where people just lose faith in the institutions. They lose faith in the currency. They would lose faith in the US dollar, and they're panic buying assets to preserve their purchasing power. And we kind of already see that in the last 10 or 15 years by a panic buying of assets, the collectible markets and the fine art market, certainly in the Bitcoin market at $30,000 a coin, up from $1. That's, you could say that the US dollar and other fiat money is already in a hyperinflationary collapse against Bitcoin. And Bitcoin would fall into the category of an asset that's sensitive to inflation. We're seeing it now. I think that we're at the beginning of a major secular inflationary move where prices, it's not transitory like the central bankers are telling us. This is a more of a secular or protracted inflationary move, which will cause an incredible damage to the economy. And as you point out, people will be panicking and trying to panically preserve whatever wealth they can. And we're already seeing that, right? We're seeing that now. People on the margins are beginning to sense that the fiat money world, and particularly the US dollar, are on the verge of a major dislocation, let's call it. And this is where we're at. We're not at the end of this, we're at the beginning of it.
By default, just like as a general practice for me, I'm biased against conspiracy theories. My lean is towards ineptitude. In the financial world, I find myself leaning less and less in that direction sometimes. But do you see what is happening in the way the financial world is just kind of getting wrecked right now as more conspiracy grand design related or more ineptitude?
I see it as criminal fraud. I worked on Wall Street for many years, and I can tell you that what's being done is criminal. During even the S&L crisis of the 1980s, it was found out the Keating Five, for example, were involved in massive fraud. Bill Black, on behalf of the U.S., put over 1,000 bankers in jail. What happened since that was that laws were changed to make what was being done during the S&L crisis, they moved it from being illegal to legal. So by doing this, and by also introducing laws like the several others since then, repeal of Glass-Steagall, getting rid of the short sale rule, the Commodity Futures Modernization Act. So the bankers with enormous lobbying have been able to shape the financial landscape in ways to make what was used to be, even 20 years ago, illegal, to make it legal. And the results are quite predictable and stunning. We see literally trillions of dollars being handed over to a criminal class. And that's completely factual. There's nothing even remotely debatable about that. It's so blatant and rampant and ugly. I mean, you go back to the 2008 crisis. During congressional testimony, the head of Goldman Sachs, under oath, said that not only did they knowingly sell what he called bags of shit to their customers, this is be derivative, tranches of derivative packages that contain worthless garbage. Not only did they knowingly sell this to their own customers, But then they then made bets against those companies that they just sold the shit to, knowing that the stock was going to go down because they just bought that shit. Now that's more than just fraudulent behavior. That's a systemic, coordinated, premeditated attack using, as Warren Buffett called them, weapons of mass financial destruction. This was more than just a financial crime. It was a financial atrocity. But they pay a small fine. So the business model is, we get to keep 90 cents of every dollar we steal. That's the business model. And if you talk to these guys on the side, that's exactly what they'll say. They'll just say, look, we don't give a fuck. We keep 90 cents of every dollar we steal, and we have every single politician in our pocket. Nobody's pushing back. Fuck them.
Is this a complex problem of people that think they're doing the right thing, think they can help, etc., or a very simple problem of greed?
Well, I mean, Jim Jones thought he was doing the right thing in Guyana when he had everybody drink the Kool-Aid and created a mass suicide event. He believed he was doing God's work. So does Lloyd Blankfein. He believes he's doing God's work at the time, right? So psychopaths think they're doing the right thing, and they can lead people into total disasters. So there's a remedy. Those remedies are not being acted upon. I guess if you have psychopaths that are printing money and causing atrocities, and that's not completely mysterious. If you're giving somebody, a psychopath, the opportunity to do this with impunity, they're going to do it. I think more interesting from my perspective is how the financial media has failed to cover this all over the world. In the UK, the US, Europe, Asia. It's amazing to me that nobody in financial media, except for Keiser report now for going on 13 years, nobody in financial media anywhere in the world has done an accurate job in reporting on this blatant crime wave, which is indisputably criminal. Control fraud at the highest level, no debate about it. There's absolutely no debate about it. It's a story that they don't cover. That, to me, is really the remarkable part. I understand why somebody would go on a serial killing spree against their own customers. I get that, because they're sick. But I don't get is how financial media doesn't report on it. That's a bit of a mystery to me. Except for Matt Taibbi. Matt Taibbi, I should just call out Matt Taibbi for a second. He has done fantastic journalism, investigative journalism in this field. And remember, every conspiracy starts as a conspiracy theory.
Yeah. I think a good deal about the Dark Ages. And we love books that are set in the Dark Ages, where it's some peasant boy, gets kicked off of his line of life by some random event and, falls into a struggle and goes through the hero's journey, becomes a knight, and, moves his town or his region towards more glory and honor and freedom. And it's really a little earth-shaking to close the book and think that pretty much did not happen, and that's why it was the Dark Ages. Like, that story that we love so much, it was either no one was able to stand up and live that story, or people were shut down and killed before they could even begin. And that, to me, one of the more terrifying things I can think of. You spoke of atrocities. How truly horrible can the effects of inflation be? We tend to, make this stuff not real. How bad can the devaluation of money actually be?
Well, we have plenty of historical examples. So you have the Weimar Republic, which gave rise to fascism in Germany, and World War II, and hundreds of millions of dead people. That's related to money printing, hyperinflation. Venezuela today is struggling. You have Zimbabwe went into free fall. So this is what we're talking about. The U.S., Josh, when you read stories like Facebook is working with the US government, who is essentially telling them what they can and cannot post on Facebook. Okay, that's corporations and government fused together, right? That's a corpocracy, which is a really nice way to say fascism. And we know that's not good.
It's a bit terrifying. It's easier to create a movement for fuzzy kittens that are in danger or homeless dogs. It's a little bit more difficult to create a movement for kids in North Korea that are taught that love is against the law from birth, or that it doesn't even exist. Why is that, first of all? Why is it that we don't want to look at it? And second, how do we shift it?
Right. Well, I mean, that's a huge topic. And, there's a lot of different ways to get into it. Let me just jump to the end and say that I don't think it makes sense for you and I to sit here and try to figure out how to solve the big problems, because ultimately the only problem we have to solve is ourselves. If we solve our own self, then that's the only step we can take. And it's a really positive step. And that brings us back to Bitcoin, because Bitcoin, as Stacy likes to call it, is relentless optimism. There's the past is the past. Every block is immutable and it's in the past. There's no revisionism. You can't go back and change the past like 1984, dystopianism. It is the past and it's over and it's done, and you can go check it. And we can just focus on the now and the future. And the future is unpredictable because you never know where the difficulty adjustment's taking us. And it's a mystery. And we're all in the same mystery, and we're all equally powerful and powerless in this grand mystery. And we're all in the same kind of, pilgrimage to a truth, that who we are as a species. And we do it on an individual basis, and we're individually sovereign. And so we're kind of removed now. We're removing ourselves from all the apparatus that you're describing there of fear mongering, war mongering, violence mongering, influence peddling, all that stuff. You can opt out essentially. And we're seeing it in El Salvador. It's going to be a really great experiment. Other countries in the region are doing the same thing. So we're going to have a real-time experiment to see what happens when you free a population from the state in terms of their money, and they can transact with each other without being censored and without fear of debasement. In fact, our purchasing power is mathematically guaranteed to continue to go up for 100 years or more, forever. So we're going to find out what happens. This is happening in the United States. It's happening more on a state-by-state basis rather than the country as a whole. So in like Wyoming, they're already like, yeah, we love Bitcoin. You see the mayor of Miami is going into Bitcoin. Cities are opening their doors to Bitcoin mining, particularly since the migration out of China. So we're seeing something we saw similar in the marijuana business, where states became friendly on the legal front, and then other states kicked in, and then now it's heading to a federal law. So in the U.S., I would imagine after the states start to become more Bitcoin centric, you will end up with some federal laws that are pro Bitcoin. And because they need to compete, they need to compete with countries that are already pro Bitcoin. So El Salvador is a $20 billion economy. That GDP is probably going to triple. They're probably going to pay off their IMF loan with a Volcano Bonds that I've suggested. And the property prices are moving up. The people are already, getting 20% more in GDP per year simply on the savings on the remittance market. And they're going to have tourism, industry is going to develop thanks to what's happening there. People are already flocking to El Salvador and Bitcoin Beach. So that's what's happening. So I think all the negativity, we never really had the option before in history to simply opt out. You can simply opt out with Bitcoin. And as more people do it, it's like the Heisenberg principle. The negativity only exists to the extent that we look at it. Once we're looking at Bitcoin and not looking at the negativity disappears. It's just a quantum phenomenon. It doesn't exist. It only exists to the extent that we let it exist. And once we don't look at it anymore, it's not there. It was never there.
So choose a life structure in which those horrors just couldn't occur.
That's what Bitcoin does. And that's what people are choosing.
That makes sense. I had somebody come to me recently stuck in a, let's call it a philosophical loop. You know how there's many questions you can kind of ask yourself that they have no answer. And I mean, I think they're called cones in the East, right? That's even the point, right? And I just said, also, there's the solution to stop thinking about it. What you're saying kind of reminds me of that. It's more like stop acting about it so that you have a different environment to live in. I like that a lot.
Yeah, there's definitely an East-West split. So in the Cone poems and the Eastern philosophy and religions, there is definitely this idea, in Zen, etc., of meditating in a way that simply takes you to a different place. And you can do that purely through meditation, through your own exploration on the path, the way, right? And it's definitely more in Eastern philosophy. In America during the 60s, there was a huge uptick in interest in this type of thing. The writings of Alan Watts, for example, and others introduced Eastern thoughts, and it became quite popular in the U.S. as part of the quote hippie generation. And this was a big part of a culture, the youth movement, as it was called, in the 60s, who completely changed global culture with extraordinarily cheap technology of the time, which was the vinyl record, played over the absolutely for free radio. So you had artists able to cut records for almost nothing, and it would go on radio for free, and it mobilized a generation to have what we now look back on as being this phenomenal burst of creativity and excitement, usually associated with rock and roll. So here we have the really, really cheap access of cheap telephony. You can get a mobile phone cheaply. Almost everyone in the world has access to a mobile phone these days, and the price keeps getting cheaper and cheaper. You're on an app like Strike from Zap, from Jack Mallers, and you're transacting in Lightning, and you're saving in Bitcoin. And so you take that rock and roll moment and you see a global phenomenon that nobody can stop. The culture of the 60s was considered dangerous, toxic rock and roll maximalists like the Rolling Stones, toxic rock and roll maximalists like the Beatles were condemned by the status quo as being dangerous and toxic. But they rolled over everybody, and they planted their flag on the moon in 1969, and we got MTV, right? So it's just things change quickly with really cheap technology and a cultural zeitgeist. And so that's where we're at now in 2021 with Bitcoin, Strike, El Salvador. This is really the rock and roll of the 21st century. It's a global movement. And there are people that are just diving in it and swimming in it, living it, who are already divorced themselves from the nonsense. They're already months and months out into Bitcoin space. They left Planet Disaster already a year ago, and they're traveling on the Bitcoin vector. And the Bitcoin vector is headed toward a place where there is very little of this or none of the current shit.
I can't have you mention Volcano Bonds and not ask you about them. Could you talk a little bit about that, El Salvador in general and Volcano Bonds? I would love to hear about that.
Oh yeah, well, Volcano Bonds, it's pretty straightforward. So the geothermal energy in El Salvador is dirt cheap, almost free, and they're going to use it to mine Bitcoin. So you could create a volcano bond that'll pay off in future Bitcoin mining revenue and sell those bonds today. It's just a classic asset-backed bond that trillions of dollars of those float around the world every single day. So I think El Salvador, given the access that they have to the energy and their intentions for Bitcoin mining. They think they're going to do $1 billion in revenue next year in Bitcoin mining. So that would extrapolate out to a minimum of 10, possibly 15 billion in Volcano bonds that you could take the cash today, depending on maturity, coupon rate, and other factors that go into pricing bonds. And they could immediately pay off their IMF loan. They could recapitalize their entire economy because it's only a $20 billion economy. They could, whatever debt they have, they could retire it, and recapitalize down to de minimis coupon rates and recapitalize the country. The numbers suggest that they could do that. And the bonds themselves, we live in a world where the 10-year U.S. Treasury bond is at like 1.4%. And there's huge demand for that, believe it or not. So, okay, the El Salvador 20-year Volcano bond backed by X number of terawatt mining capacity, you could probably sell 1 billion of those at a 4%, 3.75% coupon. So you're getting $1 billion at 3.75%. Okay, you get it. It's easy. There's going to be a huge market for it because they're getting double what they're getting on a U.S. Treasury. It's not going to be AAA rated, but I'm sure it'll be double B plus or something. That's investment grade, probably. You could make it investment grade. There's a couple of really good bankers in Bitcoin, like Mike Novogratz is a really good banker. He comes out of banking. He's a good banker. He could spin this up in a week and sell it. Do it,
We have, I believe, a mutual friend, JP Barrick, CEO of Mining Store, and I've been chatting with him a lot and getting more and more fascinated in Bitcoin mining. In light of what you said about focusing on the positive, what are some of the good things that Bitcoin mining can do?
Oh, there's a huge, extraordinarily positive thing that Bitcoin mining do, and that is that it would cut human energy usage in half. So we've got 170,000 terawatt of energy per year is the current number. If the world goes on a Bitcoin standard, that means that, and central banks go out of business. Banks, by and large, are disintermediated out of business. And because Bitcoin's unconfiscatable, you don't really need a war. You don't really need a military either. Right? The U.S. spends half of all tax dollars on the Pentagon. So that's a budget of like almost $2 trillion just for the Pentagon. Completely extraneous in a hyper-Bitcoinization world where wealth is unconfiscatable. What are you going to do with the battleship if you can't coerce people to give you their stuff? Why bomb Afghanistan or Iraq if you can't get any oil? The oil of the 21st century being Bitcoin. So very quickly, you don't need any of that apparatus. So, and that's true for all countries. So global energy uses drops, let's say cut in half. So that's an incredible benefit from hyper-Bitcoinization in the world through Bitcoin mining, essentially. Bitcoin mining makes that happen. Countries start to reallocate resources away from their military toward Bitcoin mining. Countries that are marginal, that might have, let's say, military budgets. A lot of countries have military budgets, and they buy jets and stuff from the UK, primarily as a huge weapons dealer, from the US, huge weapons dealer. And these could be, let's say, a lot of Middle East countries, Middle Eastern countries buy lots of weaponry from the UK and the US. And they're protecting their oil fields. And oil is the 20th century, the dollar is based on oil. It's the petrodollar. Right? Ultimately, Bitcoin will disintermediate oil as well. So oil is also in trouble. But so these countries, they buy some weapons, and then they see that actually, that money, if we put it into Bitcoin mining, we would have this unconfiscatable, immutable asset that's guaranteed to increase purchasing power forever. Let's do it. And then that'll set off game theory in the Middle East, like we see game theory playing out in Latin America. So what the UAE or somebody, the Saudis, some potentially, the Ghawar oil field in Saudi Arabia is tapped out. There's, they're drilling sand at this point. That's nothing. It's not much there. So they transitioned to Bitcoin mining. And then other countries are like, hey, we're wasting our money on our defense budget as well. We're going to go into Bitcoin mining. I think the holdout is probably China, because I think they really feel like they're on a roll recently. They may be late to the party on this one. And they just kicked out, 40 or 50% of the hash rate. They kicked out of the country. That could be seen as one of the stupidest things any country's ever done. Not since China itself, 500 years ago, burnt their entire navy. They burned it to the ground. Considered to be one of the stupidest thing any country, it was an empire, the Ming Dynasty, has ever done in history. This could be so stupid. It's on a par with the Ming Dynasty disastrous burning of their navy. That's how stupid it could be. And we were looking back and see it. They may have completely fucked up.
I love the scale at which you're speaking. It's so big. Is it reasonable to think on a grand scale like that, where Bitcoin has the capacity to defund a military, essentially?
Yeah, well, let's talk about scale for a second. Let's talk about infinity. Okay, so with the protocol, you got a dual infinity at work. So on one hand, you have the insatiable appetite of the protocol for energy to drive hash rate higher. And hash rate is heading toward infinity. There's nothing that would stop hash rate from going toward infinity. And that would mean the price goes to infinity. There's a $400 trillion global market cap for stuff, right? Stocks, bonds, real estate. And the global economy is, you could say it's $400 trillion. So that's the total addressable market. So Bitcoin was at $1 trillion recently. It's under $1 trillion. Let's just say it's hovering around $1 trillion. So that's a 400x for Bitcoin price from the current price. So there's that infinite direction on the hash rate. Then on the other side of the scale, there's another piece of infinity, and it's infinitely small versus infinitely big. The infinitely small part of the protocol has to do with the target number that's adjusted every difficulty adjustment. So as hash rate and price go up, the target number gets smaller to make sure that there's an emission schedule every 10 minutes. And it approaches zero. It can't get to zero, theoretically, but it's constant. Let's call the zero the infinity bound. So, but it's always going to get closer and closer and closer to zero. It's infinitely closer to zero. It's Zenon's paradox on an infinite scale. It just constantly gets closer to zero. So you've got those two directions are going in kind of like opposite directions to infinity. That's the scale that we're talking about. And in between is our life, is humans on planet Earth as we're experiencing this right now. It's cosmic. There's a cosmic scale to it on both. And if you think about our history, we've always had this twin cosmology going. We've always been exploring the cosmos, outer space, and the solar system, and we've got probes, and we're looking at stars, and we've got the Hubble telescope, and we can map the cosmos. But we're also mapping the gene and the genome and the cell and quantum probing, and we've got the gluon and the antiparticles and the antimatter and the subparticles, right? So we're always going in both directions all the time anyway. The infinitely small, infinitely large. And Bitcoin captures that. It's got the infinitely small target number and the infinitely large hash rate. So it's just ripping the cosmos a new asshole, essentially. And that's where we live.
Why does this process of Bitcoin becoming a more and more fundamental element of the economy and the ability for governments to print dollars sort of, let's just call it evaporating over time? Because I guess essentially the story changes, right? And once that story is rejected, the printing is rejected. How is it possible for that to reduce violence? Why is that?
Well, simply coercion doesn't pay. You can't monetize it. You can't coerce or violently extract my keys, my private keys. It's unconfiscatable. So people who would normally be in the violence business get into a different business, maybe making macrame vests for hippies or something. But it doesn't completely eliminate violence. I mean, you'll still have psychopaths out there and crazy people, but the violence industry and the prison industry are demonetized because they don't pay. People are not going to spend Bitcoin to buy a battleship or a jet because they'd rather just hodl, because the jet doesn't hold its value. The battleship takes too much maintenance. It's a waste of money. And I can't use it to steal Bitcoin from anybody. So why do I want to even buy a battleship? So with less weapons, there's less violence. The mindset changes. People's idea of, property changes. And there is an emergent egalitarianism, which would also demonetize violence as well, where people are just chilled more. They're like, I'm happy with my Bitcoin stash that's guaranteed to increase purchasing power forever. And I'm at my pottery wheel making coffee cups. Greg Maxwell, one of the core developers, is essentially retired and fixing pianos. He's got a huge stash of Bitcoin and he's just fixing pianos somewhere. That's it. He's achieved oneness with the cosmos, which is available to anybody. The dualism anyone has, or the sense of awkwardness with life, would disappear. You're just in life. You're not observing life. You're in life. You're alive. So if you remove the threat of violence, is also a huge factor that keeps people in a state of neuroses and in some cases psychoses, just having the threat of violence, which is omnipresent, right? So if you turn on television, it's like pretty much it's a vomit. It's like violent bulimia. When you turn on the television, it's like just a stream of projectile vomit of violence, just knocking you in the face. That's all it is. Because it's profitable, because of fiat money, and because of all the ways you can use fiat money to make violence incredibly profitable, and prisons. So when you demonetize it, when you switch over to a Bitcoin standard, it's not profitable anymore. The fundamental question of why would this happen? Well, why it happens is because us humans want it to happen. And it gets back to the hero's journey, and it gets back to the story. Our story is one of the hero's journey. We have obstacles, we have trials, we have tribulations, but we're on a journey of peace, essentially. We're essentially peaceful. And we want to trade, we want to socialize, we want to meet mates, we want to procreate, we want to do these things. That's who we are. And if we can do it without any violence, we're going to do it. And that's what Bitcoin offers. So you meet a lot of Bitcoin nomads, as they're called today. I travel around and people are just traveling the world, sitting on their Bitcoin, meeting up, socializing, trading a little bit, doing a little this, a little that. And they are self-actualized. They are happy within their skin. They're not suffering from neurotic breakdowns. They're not taking antidepressants. They're not taking opiates. They're not dying from opiate overdoses. And they're living their best Bitcoin life. Because that's what we want to do it. And there are periods in history, like, let's say, the Renaissance in Florence, 1500, because of the florin, which was the best money of that era from the Medici Bank, it laid the groundwork for the Renaissance. That's how the Renaissance came about, was having the best, hardest money in the world at that time. So that was the bedrock. So now we're having a global Renaissance, the new Renaissance, Renaissance 2.0, with taking that idea, but Now it's a global way. It's unconfiscatable. It's immutable. All that, all the best possible qualities. And people are responding. People want to respond. They're hungry to respond. We're hungry animals. We have hunger for food, for water, for sex, for self-actualization, for trade, for socializing, for curiosity. Like, we're insatiable. So, with fiat money, you have oligarchs stepping in and trying to be gatekeepers and trying to impose their fees, draconian fees, to aggregate wealth, and then they become despots. So you have oligarchs and despots thanks to fiat money, and we have a lot of people living in fear, and that's predictable. But now we have the Bitcoin community, which is opted out. They're just saying. I mean, it's like, Timothy Leary was another 60s character who was advocating, acid as a way to drop out, tune in. And so that sentiment, you could carry it forward, and say, Bitcoin is kind of like the acid of money. You can drop out and tune in, in a way, but the state is powerless to do anything about it. The nation state itself will not exist as we currently understand it within 20 years.
That's a beautiful picture to work towards. I liked what you said about, in a Bitcoin world, people not wanting to invest Bitcoin into a battleship because it wouldn't pay. One of the big first thoughts that came into my mind when I first learned about Bitcoin was, what happens when the stock market is inside of this? That just kind of blew my mind. So, yeah, my question is, what does the investing world look like inside of this potential future? I mean, we aren't going to stop investing. There is still things to be made. There's still businesses that can, grow and be worthy investments. I mean, I don't think we would want to live in a world where that weren't the case. Under this context, there's a lot of things that wouldn't pay the same. What does investing look like?
Well, we already have a great example of that with MicroStrategy. So Michael Saylor's company, MicroStrategy, look at what they've done. Okay. They have turned that publicly listed company into a Bitcoin machine. And what I mean is, first, they put a lot of Bitcoin in the balance sheet. Okay. Stock went up a lot. They got a lot of attention. And the market cap of the company went up, I think, tripled from 2 to, 6, 8, 10 billion, or I think it got as high as 8 billion. Then they started selling convertibles, that are convertible into stock to buy more Bitcoin. Price went up again. Now they just did a shelf offering to do an equity offering, stock offering, $1 billion worth, that they can pull off the shelf at any time they want, sell more stock, and the stated purpose is to buy more Bitcoin. Here's what it gets funky. So if they sell stock to buy Bitcoin, and Bitcoin continues its annualized guaranteed increase in purchasing power, the debt to equity ratio of the company's balance sheet would allow them to go out and sell more convertibles. So now they just bought more Bitcoin. Oh, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go sell another billion in stock, buy more Bitcoin. Oh, that means we can go out and sell another convertible. Let's go buy more Bitcoin. So they've created this self-reinforcing Bitcoin machine. And that's what's happening in the stock market. And that's what other companies will do. And it's the speculative attack on the US dollar and the central banks, because Michael Saylor can borrow money at 6.25% with a convertible that he's never going to have to pay off to buy Bitcoin in a world of 0% interest rates. So, this is going to be repeated by other companies. That's what happens in the stock market. Most of them become Bitcoin centric. That's what happens.
I'm going to push on that. So what happens after?
Well, he still have a software business, it's enterprise software business, and now they're going to push that business. The morale of the company. I asked him this in Miami when I interviewed him. I did the fireside chat. I was like, how is the morale at MicroStrategy now? I mean, you're the CEO, you made this strategic pivot, and so what's happening back at the store, and he's like, morale is great. People are excited. We've got new breath of fresh air, and they're cranking out software. I guess they're going to do more in the cloud now that maybe they weren't really doing much in the cloud. The cloud is where all the big guys are, Amazon, IBM, et cetera, Oracle. So I think now they've got a big push into the cloud. And so their day job of software development is improved. They're probably going to hire more people, more jobs, and come up with new ways to service Bitcoin. And they're on this journey. We'll see where this goes. The stock market is a place for entrepreneurs to raise money. So we're going to see a lot of companies go public, right? Kraken's gone public. Coinbase went public. You've got several of the Bitcoin mining companies have gone public. Several more are going public. They're raising a lot of money. Then you have apps on the application layer. So I would imagine a company like Zap, right? Jack Mahler's company is probably being teed up for some kind of offering. I would imagine it's very, very early for them, but the growth that they're doing is crazy. You've got a lot of venture funds that are focused on Bitcoin. Max and Stacy, we've had a fund now since 2013 called Heisenberg Capital, and we've invested in 15 different Bitcoin-related startups, including Kraken. And so now these are going public. And so what will we do? We'll probably look for more, opportunities in that space. The stock market's sensitive to trends in the marketplace. So the trends are very Bitcoin centric, and it will accommodate that.
I have a couple lighter, quicker questions to get us towards the end. We seem to be moving towards a world where borders become a little bit more debatable in terms of a personal life. Do you have any advice for somebody that's starting to live in the world versus in a state, a country, etc.? How should somebody look at something like that? And also, what's been your favorite place to live? Because I know you've traveled a lot.
Well, what's happening is there's a mentality emerging that countries are service providers, and you want to go where and get the best service provider you can. So Katie the Russian, I believe is her Twitter handle, who's in the business of selling second passports and third passports and getting people their second passports. She made this point recently on, I think it was Fox Business News, that, that's the way she sees the world. That, countries are service providers, and I want to go where I get the best service. So that's the way I think people should look at it. If the U.S. is not really worth it, they're not providing me the services that I feel it's worth being here, I will go somewhere else. I think this is the way people are thinking. And again, when you have portable wealth that's unconfiscatable, and you can just go into the airport naked and show up in, Barbados or someplace, and you have all your wealth with you, and just say, and the government very friendly, and say, okay, thank you, government of Barbados, you are doing a good job collecting my garbage and other building roads, thank you, and I will pay you a stipend every year from my Bitcoin. And they'll happily take your Bitcoin because they want to get as much Bitcoin as they possibly can, just like any other government. So it's the people are going to be running the show. The governments will be returned to their role as designed as being civil servants and garbage men.
What are you working on currently? And where do you want to send people online? Things like that.
What we're working on currently is just like this whole idea of doing a global tour, going to cities like whether it's Austin, Texas, or now we're going to go to Phoenix, get in contact with the local Bitcoin community. And it's kind of like a Bitcoin meetup gone crazy. It's a party, there's a bar, there's music, there's a show, right? So it's entertainment, party, meetup, Max and Stacy, and featuring local folks. So we're going to Phoenix. So I'm in touch with the local pizza joint that is kind of like the meetup spot for Bitcoiners. They're going to be there. I'm talking to some other folks that are Bitcoin people in Phoenix. Phoenix is kind of under the radar a bit. It's not quite has the cachet or the visibility of some other places, but it's becoming more of a Bitcoin mining hub. And we find a venue, it has to have certain, we like venues that have an outdoor area and an indoor area. People like to kind of wander around a bit. A stage, good sound system, like 200 to 300 capacity, not too big, not too small. Like that's a good size venue for us. And so when we find the venues, we just do it. So we're going to go to Paris in September. We were invited to speak at an event there to do, my Fuck Elon tour, as I'm calling it. So we're going to be speaking to a group in Paris. They're very anxious to have us there. They love the whole idea. So they are very anxious to have us there. They are flying us over, and they're very excited. So that happens in September. So then the next October, we're looking at Nashville as a possibility, Orange County, California, Seattle. So they're kind of like working through these different potential cities, but we want to just go to these different cities to have these events. So we're on the ground, ground force, we're troops on the ground, boots on the ground in the Bitcoin army. Michael Saylor, he's talking to the institutions and, high level executives. That's what he's doing. We're doing this, this is what we're doing. This is how we think we can kind of spread the message and have fun, and have fun. I feel like at this point, after doing this for 10 years, I'm more interested in having fun than I am getting involved in another fucking debate about why such and such a shitcoin is a shitcoin. I've been in that debate now for 10 years, and I've seen the best of my generation go down in a flame of shitcoinery. And, it's time to have fun. Just stupid. They're all a waste of time. Just don't bother.
As somebody who went to the Austin event, I can attest it was a good time. It was an excellent place to meet folks of, a specific interest, which is a lot of fun. It's great to, be able to go to an event and walk up to somebody and say, hey, do you like this? Do you like Bitcoin? And, now you have some common ground.
So, every single person there is a Bitcoiner, right? So that's another thing. So there's nobody there that's not there for Bitcoin in the venue. So like we had somebody called us and said, hey, you can have half our venue. Okay, but we're going to have the regular customers over here. And I'm like, no, that's not going to work. I want everyone there to be completely just going to talk to everybody because they know we're totally on the same page. So that's part of the magic of it.
I have two last questions for you that I'm going to say at once because I'm sure that you can wrap them in a bow. What is the importance of optimism, and what would you like people to take away from this podcast?
Well, optimism is open-ended and pessimism is closed-ended. Pessimism has an end game. It's called death. And optimism has an infinite potential. And so for the average person to be sitting in the space of optimism is much more satisfying and gratifying and soul fulfilling. Whereas pessimism is basically stifling and coagulating and stinky because you're festering and, you've got one foot in the grave. There's a place for being pragmatic or, being a realist, right? But you can still be that way within the construct of optimism. I've had this conversation with other people in the finance business. The reason why pessimism sells better than optimism is that the story of pessimism is very easy to sell. And that's why most of the news you hear is pessimistic, because it's an easy sell. And like I was a stockbroker on Wall Street for many years, it's much easier to get somebody to buy somebody from a point of view of pessimism than optimism. So what I mean is that if you're a salesperson on Wall Street and you're talking about a stock, it's much easier to get somebody to buy that stock by inducing fear than it is by building a story of optimism. And optimism tends to rely on vague and more subjective things like faith, and whereas pessimism is usually quantifiable and it's more visible. I could say to you back in 1998 that, Apple Computer, even though Michael Dell just said that they should close shop and that they'll never be successful again, and it's a piece of garbage at $16 a share, that Steve Jobs is coming back into the company, and they have a thing called an iPod, and it's a revolutionary concept, and the stock's going to go to new all-time highs. And people would say, well, I believe Michael Dell's story because I'm a rational, pessimistic person, and Michael Dell is a success with his computers, and I'm not going to buy into your hype, man. Steve Jobs is dead. Okay, well, now it's the biggest company in the world, or usually in that category. It was all based on optimism and faith, and similar to Bitcoin. The pessimists don't have a story. They're not even remotely in the building to have a story about the story, suggesting a story. Their history.
Max, this has been an absolute pleasure. I am a big admirer of your work, and it's been wonderful to have you on. Thank you so much for coming on.
Sure, Josh. Anytime.